Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be giving my thoughts on the 2024 horror films that I've seen and wrap up the year by giving my general thoughts on where the genre is. I will organize this video through a tier list, so let's begin. We'll start with The First Omen, which I'll be putting in A tier. I was excited to go and see the film after the marketing campaign really blew me away, and the film was very impressive and a solid entry into the franchise, a franchise that is not necessarily known for consistent quality after the classic original film. The film was directed by Arkasha Stevenson, who I thought did a very good job really selling the feel of the film, the time period of the film, the setting, and the horror of the situation that our main character finds herself in. There's some really great intense scenes, there's some great kill scenes that are in a way kind of playing off the original film. I thought it was a great lead performance by Nell Tiger-Free. I was really impressed by her, and she had a very, just over-the-top, excellent performance that really feels like it belongs as one of the best performances of the year in a horror film. In general, I think the film was very well directed. I think it's just a very solid film with great performances all around, great actors, right? The whole cast is just stacked with really good actors who would do a great job of really committing to the film. It's not just some half-assed horror remake or anything like that. This is a very solid horror prequel, and in general, I'm just excited to see where all these people go from here, and I think the franchise now has been breathed some new life into it, and it's shown other franchises how you can do a prequel or a sequel effectively. So overall, A tier. The only thing that really holds it back is its constant need to try and tie into the larger franchise. I think those constant little tie-ins hurt the film on an overall sense, but for the most part, very well made. Next up is Immaculate, which is considered a twin film to The First Omen, and I also saw it in theaters around the same time. Now, the film is nowhere near as good. It pales in comparison to The First Omen, and for that reason, I'm putting it into the D tier. In a lot of ways, the film feels like a generic nunsploitation film. I think Sydney Sweeney's performance, in direct comparison to Nell Tiger-Free's, is lacking, and maybe this is why the film doesn't hold up as well in my mind, because I make such direct comparisons to The First Omen, which is one of my favorite movies of the year in general. So this film really does suffer in comparison. It feels a lot more generic. While there is creepy moments at times, and there is a generally good atmosphere that they're able to nail, the film has a disappointing unraveling of its mystery. And I do think Sydney Sweeney's performance, unfortunately, is not good enough to be able to transcend the generic trappings of its subgenre. I just don't think it holds up as a good horror film despite having some decent atmospherics and some decent scenes here and there. It's a film that ultimately is very forgettable and unfortunately also was released right next to The First Omen and is such a similar movie that the fact that it was executed at such a lower level really makes it one that I just kind of forget about in comparison to the very memorable The First Omen. Next up is Abigail, which I'm putting into the C tier. Now, to be honest, I was not really looking forward to this movie, but I did go and see it in the theaters nonetheless because I was kind of intrigued by the concept. I'm not a big fan of Scream 6. I thought Scream 5 was okay, but Scream 6 I really did not like. It was one of my least favorite films, horror films of 2024. I went on a big rant on it, I think, in my last year's video, but that one might have been deleted due to copyright issues. I wasn't really looking forward to this film necessarily, but it kind of did blow me away. Not that it was a great film by any means, but that I liked it so much. The cast was very likable. There was a lot of fun performances, especially from Dan Stevens and Giancarlo Esposito. The film had some awesome effects, and they really pushed the gore in this film, which I love when that happens. And it's a funny film. The humor didn't grate on me like it did in Scream 6, and it actually commits to killing people, which is my major critique of that film. One of my major critiques of that film was there was no tension, and then even when you did seemingly kill people, they were just right back alive, right? They just somehow survived like a million stab wounds. Abigail is just this really fun a film that really pushes the gore, which I love. The setting is just excellent, and like I said, the cast is great. It's a fun movie. It's not necessarily the best movie of the year, but it helps to get these two directors into my good graces again, Matt Bettinelli, Open, and Tyler Gillett. And now I'm excited to see what they do next. Right after my major disappointment of Scream 6, this was a fun film. It was, like I said, good cast, Melissa Barrera, Dan Stevens, Catherine Newton. All these people are really fun. They have a fun time. You can clearly tell that they were having a good time with this movie. A fun little vampire movie. Not going to necessarily be in the best of the year, but C tier I think is where it belongs. A nice little fun movie. Never Let Go I'm putting into the B tier. Now the film was directed by Alexandre Aja, a filmmaker I've been following for years now. I'm a big fan of some of his works, and other works that I'm not as much of a fan of, that I have strong critiques, they still stick with me. A film like High Tension, even though I have strong critiques of the film, it has had such a weird impact on me that I can't deny that it's still a film that I do have strong feelings about, I guess, that it is not one that I can just forget about so easily. It's a memorable film, and so for that reason, it's an important film to me, and I think some of his other work is also really intriguing. Hills of Eyes is one that's really brutal and I love, despite a lot of my critiques of that film as well. Now, Halle Berry was in the film, and I thought she did a really good performance here. I think this is a good film from him. He's kind of moved into this mainstream Hollywood horror director role, and I think he did a really good job with this. This was originally going to be the release window for Saw 11, which got delayed, and I think that this is a movie that didn't really get great reception, get great box office, but I think it's kind of one of the underrated horror movies of the year, and I think Aja in general is one of the underrated horror directors working in a mainstream context in the current day. I think this is a very interesting and weird movie. So yeah, this is a weird movie, but it's one that's very well done by Aja. He does it in his own unique way that you wouldn't see from other mainstream American horror filmmakers. Halle Berry, like I said, had a great performance. The child actors did a really good job, which I was surprised by. Usually, child actors can really hurt horror films, but they did a really good job with this one. The setting is just awesome, and the storyline, the basic concept of it, it does seem to kind of fit within like a generic horror film kind of cliche of a film like A Quiet Place or Bird Box or something like that, but it's done in such a different way that I find it so intriguing, and I think that the acting is part of what sells this movie. The landscape, like I said, is really cool. The photography of the film really sucks you into this awesome world, and you're constantly in tense moments, and you're constantly off kilter and not at ease ever, really. There's a few moments that are slower, that can get you character moments, but it's always in this sort of bleak, despairing mood that's always kind of overriding everything, even the good moments of it. So like I said, it's a weird story in the vein of some of Aja's other works. It kind of reminds me of his film Horns, which is another one that has its problems, but I like a lot. For a mainstream horror filmmaker, he's really doing things that you wouldn't see in other mainstream horror films. And something that Aja continues with his work here is the very strong emotional core he has to his stories of survival. That dog scene made me cry, and obviously the scene that how it extends even further than that was a really emotionally draining moment in a very bleak film. I can kind of see why this movie's sort of off-kilter and weird enough that it wouldn't do well within America or really at the box office, but I think Aja is someone that should continue to be given chances, and I hope that he continues to be able to make these mainstream American horror films because he's doing them in such a unique way that you don't see from these other filmmakers. And I'm excited to see films like Crawl 2 and things like that that are going to be coming out sooner or later. So yeah, solid film, B tier. Next up is Smile 2, which I'll be putting into the S tier. Now this movie really blew me away. I mean, I was expecting it to be a pretty good film. I was expecting it to be a really good sequel. I was having high expectations going into the film. I was really looking forward to it, but it blew me away. It was a great film. It was a better film than the original. It was an excellent sequel. It really expanded everything, made it all more intense and more elaborate and more just over the top, but was also a much more effective usage of the concept, the core concept of the entire series now, this base concept of the whole smile virus. And Naomi Scott in her whole role as this star idol is just such a perfect vessel for this type of story. Naomi Scott gives an amazing career-defining performance. She was really immaculate in this movie, and the horror is all through her experience, and she really sells it. Parker Finn does a great job directing. He seems a lot more confident in this film, and you really see a lot of his development from the first film, which I thought was a really good movie. That was one of my favorite movies of that year, one of my favorite horror films of that year, just behind Pearl. But this one just really blows the original away in so many ways that I'm just so impressed. It's such a great way to expand. The movie has so many great scenes that really are great set pieces for the smile virus and the way that Finn likes to do his filmmaking. There's so many brutal, gory moments in this film. There's so many just interesting ways that the virus, or whatever you want to call it, the curse, is sort of playing with our main character, and the ending is so bleak and over the top and fun. It's just such an excellent film, and I can't wait to see what Parker Finn does in the future. I hope he continues to make horror films. I think he's just a really promising young director. I think Naomi Scott is an excellent actress. I just think everyone that was involved in this movie did a great job. It definitely deserves S tier. It's definitely going to be in consideration as my horror movie of the year, which I'll reveal at the end of the video which one is my favorite. But this one is just so good, and I was so blown away. I'm glad I got to see it in theaters. It's one of the best horror films of the decade so far. Next up is Alien Romulus, which I'll be putting into the A tier. Now, I'll say this, I'm a huge fan of the franchise. Alien and Aliens are two of my favorite films of all time. They're both easily in my top 5. I'm a big fan of Fede Alvarez. I loved his Evil Dead remake. I'm just a big fan of most of these movies that have been in the franchise, outside of maybe Resurrection, right? I like Alien, Aliens, Alien 3, Prometheus, Alien Covenant. I'm a big fan of all those films. Fede Alvarez, like I said, I'm a big fan of his Evil Dead, Don't Breathe, all that stuff. And so I had really high expectations for this movie, and I think it was a really, really solid film. It was a nice entry into the franchise. It's definitely competing up there with like Prometheus and Alien Covenant. For me, is maybe the third best entry in the franchise. It was going to be really hard to obviously match like Alien and Aliens, which are just so good and on such a different plane from everything else. But Keely Spaney was just so awesome in this movie, and so was David Johnson. Those two performances really carried the film, brought a strong emotional weight to it, had a great brother-sister bond. It was just such a great emotional core to the story that made all the action have real weight to it. And there was some really good tense scenes. It really did feel like a throwback callback to the original film. Obviously not as effective, and I think those throwbacks to the franchise were something that a lot of people critiqued. And yeah, I wasn't a fan necessarily of the overuse of all the franchise callbacks. Now look, I'm a fan of the franchise, so I enjoyed seeing a lot of these little references and Easter eggs, but it felt like they were trying too hard, like they're doing direct quotes and all that kind of stuff. So I think that harms the film somewhat, this idea that we need to Disneyfy it, right? This is a Disney alien movie. But that being said, it still is easily belonging of A tier. Similar to First Omen, I think is a very solid entry in a long-running franchise. But it does hurt itself because it tries so hard to stick itself within the general chronology of the franchise, when it should just be trying to make an effective, solid movie. That should be the goal. Now, that being said, it's a fun, scary movie. There's some really cool effects work being done. I mean, there's some really fun scenes. It's intense, right? That's what you want an alien film to feel like. It's just intense, gross, slimy, having all these weird, like, psychosexual implications and all that kind of stuff, like the original film. Obviously, the effects don't go anywhere close to the original. It's hard to really put any film in the context of Alien or Aliens. No one's going to be able to live up to those films, but this is a nice, really good entry for a long-running franchise that I'm a huge fan of. So let's keep getting films of this quality, please, Disney and everybody involved. Fede Alvarez, I'd love to see another one. I'd love to see a Prometheus sequel as well, another one from after Alien Covenant. Alien Romulus, A tier, definitely glad I went to see it in the theaters. Next up is Longlegs, the next film from Osgood Perkins. He's a director that I'm really fascinated by. I really like a lot of his work. I think he kind of started off with a really big bang. Blackcoat's Daughter was a film that kind of was an accidental masterpiece. It's one of the best films of that subgenre or genre, the sort of elevated horror, quote-unquote. So I think that was a movie that really put him on the map. His other films I like to varying degrees. None of them really could match what he was doing, though, with Blackcoat's Daughter, until we get to Longlegs, which had an awesome marketing campaign. I think that's what really got a lot of attention to it. A lot of people went to the theaters because the marketing campaign was so good. A lot of people were just interested in the film and the lore behind it. I was, too. I was looking at all those little drops on the Birthday Murders website and things like that. And I was excited to see a Nicolas Cage movie, Mika Monroe, who's an excellent actress who I rarely see in movies, but she's in all these great horror movies, and with Longlegs, firmly entrenched herself as a scream queen of this generation. And I think Longlegs had this really depressing feel that I love. It's a great film, so I'm going to put it in the S tier. It's a movie that is very bleak, depressing, and that's exactly up my alley. Now look, this was disappointing to some people. They felt like maybe the marketing didn't match the film, the hype was too much. To me though, I loved the slow burn style. I knew what to expect. I'm a huge fan of Perkins, like I said. The film has such a great feel to it, and it explores all these familiar kind of tropes, but in a whole new way, and in this slow burn style that Perkins has really mastered. It's, Catholic horror, again, that he kind of explores, which he did with Blackcoat's Daughter, and this is where he's at his most effective. It feels so deeply personal. He talked about it in interviews, right, that this is, again, a personal film, and that's also what was true of Blackcoat's Daughter. I think when he makes these very personalized films, when he makes films that go within the kind of Catholic horror framework, though, They're so unlike any other Catholic horror movies that you ever see, and it does kind of tie into other thrillers and serial killer thrillers like Silence of the Lambs, but it never fully goes in that direction. It's not satisfying necessarily as like a police procedural or anything like that, or a thriller where you're trying to detect who the serial killer is. And Nicolas Cage's performance is a huge point of contention for a lot of people. Some people thought it was just too silly. To me, though, I loved his performance. I thought it was over the top in the way it needed to be, and it really sold the horror of this situation. It was really just effective. It really had this weird, like, dreamlike trance state that really just digs underneath your skin and just stays there. It just haunts you continuously. It's a kind of movie that really does leave you thinking about it constantly, and I love those types of movies. This is the best of this type of subgenre. I love it so much. I can't wait to see what Osgood Perkins continues to do. I can't wait to see his new movie that's coming out next year. And I also must just give enormous praise to Mika Monroe, who does a great job with this film. She has a great performance. And like I said, she is just truly a scream queen. Watch her. It Follows. I can't wait to see It Follows too. Well, absolutely excellent film in contention for the film of the year. Long Legs, S tier. Next up is Chime, which I'll be putting into the A tier. Now, this is the newest film from Kiyoshi Kurosawa. It's not a full feature-length film, and it's kind of got this weird availability. I think it was released technically as an NFT, though that's not really how I saw it. It was just too complicated. I had to find it on a website. Not a feature-length film, not a film that's widely available, not one that's discussed much on these end-of-year lists or as a modern horror film, but Kiyoshi Kurosawa is such a big name. He's one of my favorite directors of all time. Cure and Pulse are some of my favorite horror movies of all time. And this one is another one in that vein, which I'm just so excited that he made another movie like this. And it shows that he still has, his fastball. This is his A game still at work. Yes, it's maybe not as good as Cure or Pulse, so that's why it's not in the S tier. It's a movie that really has that style of Kurosawa, something that he's continued to develop. And I think here he's really shortened the film. He's really just gotten to the essence of it, the essence of his style, the essence of the way he does horror, the way that he looks at societal problems, this philosophical approach, this slow burn approach that is very reminiscent of what Osgood Perkins is doing now, right? I think he's had a major influence that isn't necessarily even appreciated by most horror fans. I love the vibe of this movie. There's just such an awesome aura of terror and philosophical horror that's at play here. So I think this is an underrated movie. I think it's one that you gotta try and track down and find. Well, I'm disappointed that it's not widely available. And I'm disappointed such an amazing, influential director is someone that can't get a movie released theatrical anymore. He has to go to these weird NFT approaches. I hope his next film gets a very wide release. I hope this is a film that continues to slowly find its way to its audience. Very good film, has a great tone, feel, some cool kills. It's this depressing, bleak, slow burn horror film that makes you philosophically approach it. So I'll put it into the A tier. Next up is Under Paris, which I'm going to be putting into the B tier. Now this is just a wacky, silly film with a heart. It's a fun shark movie. It has great kills, a great usage of the underground tunnels of Paris. I'm a fan of Xavier Jean. I love Frontiers, and I found this to be another solid film from him. Now, I know from his interviews in the past that he really loved Jaws, right? That's the movie that got him into making movies, and you can see that he has a love for that movie and other old-school genre films in this one. He's referencing that film and others, and I just love having that clear passion on display when I'm watching horror films. I love watching horror films from people that are passionate about horror films. It's got some funny moments. The mayor is a hilarious character. Now, there is some questionable effects as well. This is a movie that is constantly at risk of being just too silly, and you lose that tension that it's trying to have. But the fact that it has such a strong emotional core, that it has a heart to it, that it has these main characters that you actually care about, even in the face of maybe some stereotypical ones like the mayor, I think that makes it hold up as a solid shark movie. And there is some really cool kills despite some of the questionable effects. I'm really impressed by this film. I'm disappointed that Netflix hasn't given it a physical media release yet. French horror has really had a nice little rebound in the last couple of years, and this year was a really strong one for it. This is another good one. This is another French filmmaker going back to France to make horror films, which is really cool. And I think Under Paris is a nice, solid shark movie. I definitely recommend you watch it if you're a horror fan. Next up is The Watchers, which I'm going to be putting into the D tier. This was a Shauna Night Shyamalan's feature directorial debut, and I think it was an okay film. It had decent performances from the cast. Dakota Fanning gave a good performance, etc. The film features some cool creatures, right? A nice setting. The whole idea was pretty cool. I mean, it's based off a novel, and I'm kind of intrigued to read that novel now. The setting was really intriguing, and I think that the photography really showcased it in a nice way. I just really liked the vibe that the movie was pulling off. It reminded me of like Silent Hill or the Mothman Prophecies, which are just these cool little chill horror movies that I'm a fan of. And I think while this one doesn't necessarily live up to those films, it's still a nice little movie. It shows a lot of visual talent from a Shauna Night Shyamalan, and I'm definitely intrigued to follow her career now. So like I said, nice little creepy film that has a nice vibe to it, even though it doesn't cohere into anything that good at the end of the day. Next up is The Strangers Chapter 1. Oh boy, this film. Just love it so much, don't I? Well, I'm going to put it into the F tier. I think it's a god-awful movie. I've had a really long rant about it in one of my earlier videos this year when I gave a review on The Strangers Chapter 1. I wasn't really that excited for the film, this one at least. I was intrigued by the trilogy concept that Rennie Harlin and this crew had developed. But I thought this movie, when I watched the trailer, it seemed like it was just going to be a repetition of the first movie. Unfortunately, it wasn't even that good, right? I kind of like The Strangers. This one was just a really cheap imitation where there was no tension because you just didn't give a shit about the characters. You knew exactly what was going to happen because you knew it had to follow the plot of the first film, and you knew that there was going to be this trilogy set up. You just didn't care about anybody. You thought the characters were so stupid. The characters were so dumb. This is a movie that was very poorly directed. It felt like a weird, cheap imitation of like one of those early Platinum Dunes remakes. Like that's kind of how it had the vibe of, which I like those movies, but this felt like a really cheap imitation of that. And it just had such stupid characters, such a dumb movie with so just predictable horror and nothing that wasn't just already done a million times and a million times better in every other instance. This is just such a lazy, cheap movie, and you can tell that nobody really gave a shit about it because they never even have released the sequels yet, which were supposed to be released, I thought, all in 1 year, I thought was the plan, but now I haven't heard anything about the sequels since. And I do kind of want to see the sequel still, despite all these negative things, just because, what the hell, why not? Let's just see how bad it can get, or maybe it gets better, right? I'm always willing to give films second chances and things like that. But this one was very just depressingly bad. It's one that just made me angry watching it because this is exactly the kind of hacky directing that horror gets accused of. These are the exact kind of cheap little horror films that people think of when they think of the horror film genre, as opposed to all the peaks that the genre can produce. So many people, when they put it down, they look at movies like this, and I can't really blame them when there's so much crap like this that is produced. Us horror fans, we know how great the genre can be, but films like this, it's just, there's so many of them. You gotta wade through so much crap to get to the good stuff. And I just wish less films like this were made, and I wish that the mainstream horror landscape was given to people like Alexandre Aja, like he could make more films rather than people like Rennie Harlin, who I think just completely do not deserve another opportunity to make these types of just crappy horror films that are completely forgettable. Up next is Late Night with the Devil, which I think is a clever film, and I'm going to put it into the B tier, right? It's a clever film, it's a good film. It has good acting, it has creepy moments, decent effects, it's well directed, and a lot of horror fans really love this movie. This is amongst their top horror films of the year, if not their top. To me, I like it, maybe not that much, and that's why I have it as the B tier. I think it's a good, solid horror film. Now, that being said, I did find, even though it was in such a small dosage, I do think the AI usage that they did was kind of gross. But that being said, I do think overall this is a good horror film. I don't have a million things to say about it, but I think it was a nice, little, clever horror film with a good central performance and some really creepy, tense moments. I would love to see more horror films that take chances like this going into a different type of format. So, like I said, good horror film, B tier. Next up is Maxine, which is the trilogy capper to the X trilogy, directed by Ty West, starring Mia Goth. I had really high hopes for this movie, and I was let down a bit, right? It was a bit disappointing. Obviously, Ty West is always going to have his period piece fetishism, which he really pushes to the limit in this movie. It does have fun performances. It has like a stacked cast, which is surprising for such a kind of low-budget horror film, but they must all be fans of his other work. And I think Mia Goth does a good job, but like Kevin Bacon's fun. The other actors are all really good in their roles. Great cast, fun moments in the film, but overall it doesn't really cohere into anything that's that interesting. It's just an empty and disappointing movie. It's solid, it's well made enough, but I'm just very disappointed that Ty West and Mia Goth couldn't have something a bit more transcendent for the finale. You know, X was a really good film. Pearl was amazing. It was my favorite horror film of that year. And then we moved to this film, which was just so disappointing in contrast to those other films. And look, it's still better than some of Ty West's earlier work. He's someone I had a real examination of. because early on I wasn't a big fan of films like House of the Devil, but I have really grown to love X and Pearl. And Maxine is sort of in between those two different things, those two different strands of his career, but it's still a solid film, C tier. Next up is Odity, which I'm also going to be putting into the C tier, which, this is a good, solid film. Has good directing, questionable acting, but it's able to overcome that with a nice little story. The directing is really what impressed me, and I'm really intrigued to see this director's next film. There are some genuinely tense and scary moments, and like I said, a decent enough story. The acting is not great, but it is a lower budget film, and they're really able to overcome those deficiencies by just having a really solid film that's mostly taking place at this one location. Really well made. It's not that mysterious or surprising, but it's just a really solid film. It's an old school ghost story type film that's just very solidly directed, and it's one that I definitely think a lot of horror fans appreciate. It's just simplistic style. Next up is The Soul Eater, which I'll be putting into the C tier. This is the next film from Julian Marie and Alexandra Bastillo. It's sort of a true detective style thriller film, which is a bit different than their other films previously. Obviously, they made their name with the film Inside, their directorial debut, a pure horror film. This one's more of a thriller with doses of horror mixed in. It's a really bleak film. It's a brutal film. It's got good acting and a nice core mystery to it. You're kind of intrigued throughout the film. Maybe some of the screenwriting is a bit convenient. Maybe some of the moments don't land as effectively as they need to, but it's well executed. I think the ending's well done. It feels like a better version of The Tall Man, Pascal Augier's Jessica Biel thriller that he made back in, I believe it was like 2011 or whatever. So I think The Soul Eater is a solid film, another solid French horror film. I hope that Julian Marie and Alexandra Bastillo continue to make intriguing films like this. I think a C tier is absolutely where it belongs, which leads us into the next film, Night Swim, which I'm going to be putting into the F tier. It's just ultimately a boring, bland, and generic film that feels like a cookie cutter or copy and paste effort from Blumhouse. They are known for just pumping out all these movies, and not all of them are big hits. There's a lot of films like Night Swim that end up coming out, and I think this one was just another generic sort of January horror film. There is some cool concepts here that were effective right in the original short film, but they're dragged out way beyond their potential, right? This shouldn't be a feature-length film, and despite there being maybe like decent enough acting, like it's not great, but there's a decent enough cast here, even though they're not having the best performances. But the generic writing and characterization really harms them, and nothing truly scary happens. And ultimately, none of the family horror, none of the family drama matters at all, right? There's no weight to the story at all. So this ending sacrifice that happens in the film holds no weight at all. It's just a meaningless, boring, forgettable horror film that no one's even going to remember was made in a couple of years from now. Look, I think the whole concept wasn't fit out to be a feature-length film, and I think that was the major problem. Right? You look at somebody like Kiyoshi Kurosawa. Chime was not a feature-length film, and he was able to not drag out the concept more than it required. He was able to just find the core essence of it. And I think Night Swim is one of those movies that would have been better if you want to expand it maybe to like a 30 or 40-minute film. It just shouldn't be this type of film. I think ultimately that's what failed it. It was just over ambitious for the type of project that it was. Next up is Trap by M. Night Shyamalan, which I'll be putting into the B tier. This is a concert film that stars his daughter, and I think that's kind of the core of it. He's just trying to have this fun time, this really fun, over-the-top movie, and it is that way. It just has this good feel to it. It's very fun, over-the-top, super exciting, and keeps you on your feet. It's one of the more exciting thrillers of this year. It has some really fun performances as well. Everybody's kind of serious and goofy at the same time, and constantly we're on this sort of razor's edge between being like a silly movie and being this super serious thriller featuring a serial killer. It's a very well plotted film, very well photographed. The cinematography is excellent and keeps you on your toes just as much as the thrilling story. And it's just another solid film from this director. I'm a big fan of M. Night Shyamalan. He's been making some pretty solid films as of late, and I think this is yet another just solid film, which is good for him. He isn't going, I don't think, as overly ambitious as he maybe used to be. He just is content with making these really solid, effective human drama stories that fit within genre storylines. Trap, a good film. I'm going to be putting it into the B tier. Next up is In a Violent Nature, a film that I ultimately do not see what everybody else sees in it. I'm putting it into the F tier, which might shock you. But to me, I'm more shocked and stunned with the film's reception in general. Even by mainstream critics, they all seem to be just showering this film with praise, which I find that so, crazy to me. To me, this film is a cliche, generic, and boring film that masks its unoriginality with this art house approach that they give up on constantly. The whole idea is that we're taking the slasher film and we're going through the gaze of the serial killer. And it does that at moments, but for the most part, it actually drops that a lot to go into generic slasher mode. And the film is as cliched as possible and has terrible acting, and the effects, which is one of the big selling points of the film, just feel weirdly incongruent with the film. It just takes you out of it because they're trying to be too show-offy. And now look, I think there is some potential within this type of film when there's little moments here and there that kind of tap into that potential, but for the most part, that is very few and far between in a movie that is ultimately just pretty boring and just does not keep my attention at all. It just permeates the whole film, this feeling of generic, I've seen this before, you're not doing anything that original, even though there is some cool moments here and there, like I said, with the gaze. And I think if they do a sequel, I really do hope they explore it better and they really truly commit to it. They truly commit to their atypical approach to a slasher film. So like I said, I'm just very stunned with the film's reception. I'm glad people love it. I'm glad slasher films are having a renaissance in this era, and I think this is another film that has really gotten strong praise for being a great slasher film, even though I do not agree with it at all. That's why I'm putting it in the F tier. But that being said, I would definitely be willing to give it a second chance or give a sequel a chance, but F tier for me. Next up is Heretic, which I'm going to be putting into the B tier. Now, this is just a good film. It's a religious horror film with a Saw-like main character, which just seems right up my alley, right? I really love those types of movies, religious horror films. This is one that, purports to try and be this deep philosophical or ethical kind of film that really questions your religion. To me, I never thought that those elements of the film were that deep or interesting as they were trying to be. Instead, they were just kind of window dressing on a really fun thriller film with some awesome performances. A really fun performance from Hugh Grant kind of carries the film, with also some solid performances from Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East as well. And they really felt like real characters, not just stereotypes or cliches of what a religious character would be, and I appreciated that depth that they gave them. And there was a lot of fun twists and turns in the film. I enjoyed it as a fun thriller that kept me entertained. Not as a deep, thought-provoking thriller, but one that was fun nonetheless. So like I said, B tier. Which brings us into our next film, Humane, which I'm going to be putting into the F tier. Now, this was directed by Kaylin Cronenberg in her directorial debut. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of her father's work. Brandon Cronenberg's work has slowly grown on me as well, so I had some expectations. I did hope that this movie was going to be pretty good, and it had a decent enough cast, but ultimately, they just do nothing. They have cliched characters that waste a nice, high-concept sci-fi film that ultimately goes nowhere with its story either. It's not very funny, emotional, or scary. It doesn't work on any level, and feels poorly directed, right? No emotional weight to anything that's going on. These characters just feel so cliched and so generic. I just didn't care at all. No emotional weight was given to this film, which clearly needed it. None of the supposedly dark humor moments really made me laugh that much. It's just this really poorly constructed film. And look, I like actors like J.B. Rochelle and stuff like that. I was disappointed in this movie ultimately, and that's why I'm going to be putting it into the F tier. Next up is Exuma, which is a South Korean horror film. I'm going to be putting it into the A tier. It was a really great Korean supernatural horror film that has two distinct parts. You have the first half of the film, which is kind of more of a toned-down supernatural horror film, and then you get to the second part of the film, the second half, which is this over-the-top, just insane horror film with some amazing effects and amazing just moments that happen. Lots of blood and guts and everything, and there's these different styles that are being employed. The film constantly kept me on my toes, even though it was a longer film. I enjoyed both halves of the film. I enjoyed the over-the-top finale. I loved the characters. They're so, goofy but also serious, and you really just feel for them and you cheer for them and you care for them, and that gives the film an emotional weight, brings these crazy supernatural horror moments into sharper focus because you're cheering for these characters to survive. So like I said, there is some nice effective scary moments. There's also these awesome over-the-top operatic moments as well. It's a well-crafted horror film, and it's in a genre that's starved for better quality. We need more supernatural horror films to be of this quality. I'm putting it in A tier. I really love this movie, and I definitely recommend, if you're a horror fan, to check it out. Next up is Stop Motion, which I'm going to be putting into the C tier. It's a film with some really cool effects. I'm a big fan of stop motion animation, and I think those moments in the film are really effective. I also think there's some cool effects in the live action moments as well. There's some really brutal and gory kills that I like and I appreciate. So it's this nice little brutal indie film that I like. It's got a cool concept, a decent enough story, on the acting, right? The acting's not great, but in general, I think that the concept and the execution of the effects is enough to carry this film. C tier is where it belongs, right? It's not necessarily one of the greatest films of the year, but I really do like this small little story and this exploration of going insane. And like I said, there's just these weird things that you won't see in other films because of the stop motion that they're trying to do. And I think that it had maybe potential to be even greater, but also the limitations of its budget were pretty clear on it. So I think that for what it was a nice little indie film. I definitely recommend you check it out if you're a horror fan. C tier. Next up is Infested, which was one of the biggest surprises of the year for me, and I'm going to be putting it into S tier. This is a movie that was just excellent, right? It had such a great feeling of paranoia, suffocation, and just that creepy, crawly feeling, right? I constantly was like itching my skin and just feeling like, oh, there's spiders all over me. It's just so effective. Great directing, great implementation as well of social commentary and realistic characters. At first, the characters kind of do seem a bit one-note or stereotypical, but throughout their narrative, they really grow and they really show their realistic sort of depiction of these types of characters. And look, it's ultimately the best Spider movie I've ever seen. I love this movie so much, and I can't wait to see what this director does with an Evil Dead film. I definitely recommend you watch it. It's on Shudder. It's another great French horror film. It's got a great location, great effects, right? They use real spiders and then they enhance it with CGI. It just has such a great creepy, crawly feel to it. That's what you needed, and it has some great set pieces, so I think that definitely Infested, S tier, one of the best horror films of the year. Next up is The Exorcism, which is an unfortunate film. I'm going to be putting it into the F tier. I really was massively disappointed in this film. It was unoriginal, boring, nothing happens. It's a bad film, poorly directed. There's half-hearted performances all throughout the film, or it's just bad acting, right? It's either half-hearted or just plain old bad acting. There was maybe some glimpses here and there of a better film, but they're buried so deeply throughout the entire second half of the film, which is just so generic and stupid. It's just such a weird, bad film. Not weird in a good way. Just weird in this really disappointing way where they weren't even... It just doesn't even feel like they were trying that much. And this is exactly what I'm talking about, where we need higher quality supernatural horror films. Because this genre has so much untapped potential, in my opinion. Everyone's just trying to work within the shadow of The Exorcist, and this literally is, right? They're... In the movie, it's trying to be like this meta-commentary on exorcism films and things like that. Like, look, they're making a remake of The Exorcist. The remake of The Exorcist looked like trash, and The Exorcism, is trash. It's so boring and stupid, and I wanted to give up watching it so many times, but I kept pushing through. I mean, The Pope's Exorcist, the other Russell Crowe horror film, exorcism film that a lot of people thought this was related to, yeah, that one's bad too, but that one is a lot more fun, and it's a lot more aware of what kind of movie it is. This one is just stupid as hell, and I just really hate it. So easy F tier for me. Next up is Cuckoo, which I'm going to be putting into the C tier. Now, this is a movie that I loved watching the teaser or the trailer that I believe they put it on the film for Immaculate when I was in the theaters and I saw it, and it really unnerved me. And then the film got delayed, and then I kind of forgot about it until just recently. And so I watched it just recently, and I did like it a lot. There was a really good lead performance from Hunter Schafer. I mean, she was excellent in this film. And I also think there was a fun performance from Dan Stevens. He's had a really great year, and he's really fun in this movie. Kind of a silly, fun horror film that kind of feels like an homage to Italian horror films, which is like right up my alley. It does lose some steam in the second half, and that's why it's so far down this list. But I think it's one that, as I continue to rewatch or rethink about it, it's probably going to move up eventually. In general, the second half is just disappointing because the first half was so effectively directed, and it kind of loses its way in the second half. And not in the way like an Italian horror film can do, where it kind of loses the plot, but it goes into this just insane just experience. It's not what this is doing. It kind of leans on some generic elements, which is kind of disappointing. But for the most part, I think it's a pretty darn funny movie, and it's a pretty good, effective horror film at times too. It's both scary and funny, which is rare for a horror film to be able to do both effectively. And like I said, Hunter Schafer has a great performance. The directing is solid. The location is great. The main monster isn't that cool. That's maybe part of the reason why the second half is disappointing. But I think ultimately, it's a pretty good film. The moments where they're trying to do the whole sister bonding thing maybe doesn't land beyond just kind of a cliched attempt, but nonetheless it does bring at least some groundedness to the sort of weirdness of the film. So like I said, there is some effective moments with that. There is, but for the most part, it's a C tier type of film. It's a film that's mixed. I like it a lot at moments, and there's other moments that I find are a bit disappointing. So ultimately, I do appreciate the film for its weirdness, and I hope there's more horror films that are made like this. So Cuckoo is C tier. Next up is Strange Darling, which in a lot of ways is a critical darling, right? It has very high ratings on all the websites and all that kind of stuff. To me, though, it's a D tier film. It feels very pretentious and dumb. Why even bring up the fact that it was filmed in 35mm? Why do it in this weird nonlinear way unless you're just trying to like surprise us with the one big surprise you have, and then the rest of the film is just gonna follow into place exactly how you would expect. It's a very generic film, and it's very overhyped in my opinion, despite all its sort of attempts at grandeur and trying to do this really interesting thing. And look, it's an ambitious film, and I admire when people are ambitious. I just don't think it works at all. And I think the fact that they were just trying to hide their one effective moment with the nonlinear storytelling, and you were able to kind of play with gender politics a little bit in the film at the beginning, that was like the one interesting moment. And then the rest of the film is just kind of a waste of a really good Willow Fitzgerald performance. I thought as the movie kept going on, I was just like, this is it, huh? There wasn't really anything else that kept you on your seat or anything like that. And it was just kind of surprising, like, the characters were making pretty stupid decisions, ones that you wouldn't really expect from their characters or ones that weren't really explained. But like I said, there was good performances in the film, and I don't hate it that much. That's why I'm putting it into D tier. I think there is maybe some redeeming elements, and I understand why people really appreciate the film. To me, though, it just didn't work that much on almost any level, so D tier it is. Next up is The Substance, another very hyped up movie, one that I had very high expectations based on all of the reviews and all the praise that this film was getting. And look, I really did love it, right? This one did live it up to it. For me, it's A tier. Not S tier, but ultimately I still really love the film. I love this director. I really liked the movie Revenge. I loved the performances. Demi Moore does a really great job, and the film is uncomfortable. A lot of people talk about that, but they talk about more about the like squeamishy, like goopy, gross scenes. But to me, it was the psychological moments that were most uncomfortable. The scene with Demi Moore's character where she's just feeling too self-conscious to go out to dinner was one of the most uncomfortable scenes I've ever like sat through. It was really effective, right? And I think that stuff kind of shows the effectiveness that this film has, the depth that it has, even though a lot of it is just very repetitive and overlong. And that is kind of my critique of the film, right? You're repetitively just continuing to hammer home the point that beauty standards are this really insidious thing. But ultimately, I think there isn't really that much commentary that the film has beyond that. But look, it's a really good film nonetheless, and I really appreciate the Brian Yuzna, Stuart Gordon style effects, and I really loved those little moments like I was saying about the being too self-conscious to go to dinner. That was such an effective scene. I think if they would have leaned a little bit more on that, cut a little bit of the fat of the film, the constant repetition, I think it could have been an even better film. But the ending obviously is awesome. I mean, who the hell doesn't love that? It's such a grotesque monster and all the blood and everything. Look, that's awesome, right? And there's just some really cool and funny moments throughout the film. It does kind of remind me of like a Paul Verhoeven film in a lot of ways. So it's a great film overall. A tier, that's really high praise for me. I think this is a great film, and I think Coralie Fargeau is definitely one of the best young like horror directors on the scene right now. So A tier for The Substance. Up next is Nosferatu, which I just saw recently in the theaters a couple of days after Christmas. So it's pretty fresh in my mind, right? I'm going to put it into the S tier. This is the next Robert Eggers film. I'm a huge fan of his work. Obviously, The Witch is one of the best modern horror films. And I think in this film, right, he really nails that production design feel that he always nails, right, of this historical time period. He shares that period piece fetishization that Ty West has, but for a little bit older periods, not just like this nostalgic sort of fetishization, but more just nailing the exact details to try and make it historically accurate. So you have great production design, sets, costumes, and just vibes in general that really are nailed in this film. It really is a haunting movie. That's what it feels like this waking nightmare. Everything is just so like disturbing and beautifully lit, and it has great performances all around. Lily Rose Depp has an amazing, like, just really goes all out type performance. She does great in this film. I think though that what is nice is that there is little moments of humor as well. Willem Dafoe is just outrageously ridiculous in this film, and he's like fully aware of the type of movie he's in, and he really nails it. It feels like he's in a different movie though than everybody else. Everyone else is in this like self-serious, just drama, psychosexual stuff. while Willem Dafoe was like, no, this is like I'm gonna just ham it up and just have a great time. And there's some great images in this movie. Obviously, Nosferatu, like the vampire himself, is really interesting, and there's some really cool design with him as well. Obviously, everyone talks about the mustache and everything, but he's creepy as hell as well. I just really love this movie, and I love the general vibe that it's going for, and it just really does, like I said, feel like a nightmare, which is something that all horror films are aspiring to do, but this one nails it at such a high degree, and it's such a unique film in the larger filmography of Eggers. Obviously, it's very similar in style, but to me, it just feels like a real culmination of a lot of his work. I think this is his best film to date, and I really, really like the film. Great performances all around. Definitely would recommend it, but if you're a horror fan, like you already know about this film, you've probably already seen it. So S tier, one of the best horror films of the year by far. Next up is I Saw the TV Glow, which I'll be putting into the S tier. Now, to be honest, I was kind of reticent to see this movie because I kind of just assumed it was going to be like an analog horror movie. That's kind of how people were talking about it. And so I really hate Skinamarink, and I hate analog horror stuff that I've seen. It just doesn't work for me. I understand like the vibe that they're trying to go for, but I just don't ever think they land it properly for whatever reason. Now, that being said, this movie was very surprising to me because it nailed the aesthetic exactly perfectly, and it's a beautiful, haunting, deep film that nails a feeling that is so hard to pull off in movies. Obviously, it's a trans metaphor, and that is beautiful within the context of the movie, of the moment that we're in. What an amazing movie, what an amazing metaphor, and the way that it is nailed by the director is amazing. It also feels meaningful to things and experiences outside of just that, which is what the best types of films can do. They can feel deeply personal to the director, to the creator, but they also have a universality, which I love as well. And I think that this movie is just immaculately pulled off. It's the best analog horror movie ever made, by far. It completely blew me away. There was great performances. There was this great aesthetic. The aesthetic was obviously informed by a lot of the themes of the film, right? The nostalgia, the nostalgic sort of framing of the movie, the way that everything just had this weird vibe and aesthetic that just nailed like liminal spaces and all these things that are like internet fetishization stuff that is like obsessives, right? People are obsessed with it that are analog horror and things like that, but this is like that aesthetic pushed to such an extreme and delivered at such a beautiful level that I have like completely had a just brain melt. It is such a stunningly beautiful movie and haunting at the same time. It both has like this weird melancholic nostalgic feel while also being a truly horrifying movie at the same time. There's people that weirdly say like, how is this a horror movie? It's like, how the hell could you not think it's a horror movie? It's about a truly horrifying experience of not being who you're supposed to be, of being stuck in this weird loop of existence that's completely empty and meaningless, and feeling like you are not living to the person that you're supposed to be. And I find that so deep and haunting and beautiful. And that's the best of what horror can be. Horror can be beautiful. Look at Guillermo del Toro. Obviously, this is working in a completely different wavelength than that. But to me, this is the best of what a David Lynch-inspired film can be like. I really see a lot of David Lynch. Obviously, there's like direct references like to The Return with like the music scenes and things like that. But in general, this movie, it's unsettling and has such great imagery that it was really a shock to the system. It's one of the best, obviously, horror films of this year, one of the best horror films of the decade, and it's completely made me re-examine now like what the potential of analog horror could be. Maybe it is a genre that can be better, or maybe this is the martyrs of that subgenre, and it'll never go beyond this peak. That being said, though, this is a great, great film. So that's my tier list, and like I said, I'll be telling you my 2024 horror movie of the year, and look, if you ask me next week or next month, I'm sure it'll be different, but for right now, it's I Saw the TV Glow, which is such a mind-blowingly beautiful film. It's one that is truly haunting and beautiful at the same time, like I said. Great aesthetic, but also great themes, great storytelling. Everything is just works in tandem to make this truly awesome horror movie. That being said now, the genre in general, though, I think is just very, very strong, and I think we have great international flavor as well. This is not just American horror films right now. There's so many other countries that are doing great horror films. Obviously, France, which is one that I've kind of become obsessed with lately. They had a really great year in 2024. A lot of people are saying that this is a great year. A lot of the big fans are. But there's also fans that are saying that this is a terrible year and modern horror films all suck, which I completely disagree with. I think that right now we're in a great golden age of modern horror film, and I think that this is one of the best years of recent memory. Smile 2, Long Legs, Infested, Nosferatu, and I Saw the TV Glow are all instant classics. There's so many other ones further down the list that I just absolutely adore. And I think the horror genre is in really strong hands because you have so many really talented directors that continue to go back to the well. They might leave for a little bit, but they always come back to horror, which I love. I love and appreciate that because it shows that they really are fans of the genre and they're exploring it in ways that they think are unique and deeply personal to them. So with that being said, that's my tier list. Great state of horror we're in right now. The one thing I will say, the one thing I will plead to studios and the like, is please give us more physical media releases. Infested still doesn't have a physical media release. It doesn't have a Blu-ray. It does have like international ones. It has a 4K, I believe, from France that doesn't have English subtitles. But please give us more North American Blu-ray releases of these different horror films. Give us Under Paris on Blu-ray, please. There's so many of these horror films that come out that deserve physical media releases. We are the big collectors. We will buy this stuff. I promise you. So please, give us more physical media releases. And with that, goodbye. See you next year. Next week, I'm going to be doing my 2025 horror movie preview video, so see you there.